I'll give it to 12. Well, hey everyone, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all for coming. My name is Sam Ellis, and I'm one of the programming directors here at the Federal Society for the Youth Chicago chapter. On behalf of our officers, our members, everyone, thank you again for coming to today's event, a very exciting event. We have Justice Jimmy Blacklock from the Texas Supreme Court coming for his talk, which is named The Constitution After COVID. So our speaker today is Justice Jimmy Blacklock on the Texas Supreme Court. He was appointed in 2018 by Governor Abbott. Prior to being appointed to the bench, Justice Blacklock served as the general counsel to Governor Abbott and also in the Attorney General's office under then Attorney General Greg Abbott. His earliest legal career started by being appointed to the Civil Division of the Department of Justice by President George W. Bush. And then he also served in private practice in Houston and in Austin. Justice Blacklock's educational career began in the Plan 2 program at the University of Texas, Austin, and then he received his JD at Yale Law School. He then had the opportunity to clerk for the Honorable Jerry E. Smith on the Fifth Circuit, and we're so excited to welcome our speaker, Justice Jimmy Blacklock.
Thank you, Sam. Sam was an intern at my office recently, and I didn't know he was memorizing my resume while he was interning for me. That was pretty impressive. Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be with you. It's great to be with you in person. I wish I could see all of your smiling faces, but we come to Austin. We have actually a pretty strict mask policy at the Blacklock chambers. No masks. No masks allowed. You heard a little bit about me. I'm from the Houston area, have spent most of my life in Texas, was at Yale Law School for a little while. I live in Austin now with my wife, who's also an attorney, and we have 3 daughters. Hazel is my oldest daughter. She's 10 years old. She's here with us today, made the trip to Chicago with me. And she has 2 younger sisters, Ellie and Lucy. So the Texas Supreme Court, you may or may not know much about it. I'll tell you just a little bit about it briefly. There are 9 judges on the court. We are elected. Our Constitution since 1876 has required us to stand for election, and that's what we do. And I often say that in choosing who the judges are going to be, politics is part of that process, whether it's the federal process with Senate confirmation or state processes involving election. Politics is an appropriate part, I think, of choosing who the judges are. It's not an appropriate part of doing the judging once you are on the court. And I'm proud to say that our court in Texas, despite being elected, in my experience, does a good job. My colleagues work very hard, and I as well, to apply the law impartially without regard to politics to every case that comes before us. I have 1 spot available for clerkships next year. Have to put this pitch in there. So not this coming fall, but the following fall, if you're 2L or not, if you're interested in a clerkship that year, I'd love to hear from you. I have 1 spot open, and then future years beyond that, please send me a resume. Rachel Bland, who's here, will be clerking for me starting in August. So I want to talk about the Constitution after COVID. That's the topic, and let me start with a quote from a publication issued by McKinsey & Company in May of 2020. So take yourself back to that time. And this is what they said. It is increasingly clear that our era will be defined by a fundamental schism, the period before COVID-19 and the new normal that will emerge from the post-viral era, the next normal. In this unprecedented new reality, we will witness a dramatic restructuring of the economic and social order in which business and society have traditionally operated. And in the near future, we will see the beginning of discussion and debate about what the next normal could entail, and how sharply its contours will diverge from those that previously shaped our lives. You probably remember a lot of the talk about the new normal back then. The idea that COVID ushered in a new normal. It was a very stylish way to talk for a while there. It was a phrase that was on the lips of all the mainstream opinion makers, the media, business leaders, universities, government bureaucracies, even the commercials on TV, all seem to be singing from the same songbook, as curiously they so often do. 2 years later, I don't seem to hear as much about the new normal. I don't know about you, but I don't. And there are a couple of reasons I think that might be. One is that it could be that after the initial shock of the early stages of the pandemic, Americans demanded not a new normal, but a return to the old normal. And so the reason you don't hear about the new normal anymore would be that we rejected it. They pitched the idea as hard as they could, but we didn't buy it. And we're headed back to where we were. It could also be, though, that the reason you don't hear about the new normal anymore is because we're already living in it. It's already replaced the old normal. Perhaps what was called the new normal in the spring of 2020 is just plain normal today. And if it's true, as McKinsey said, that we will witness or are witnessing a dramatic restructuring of the economic and social order in which business and society have traditionally operated, then you'd expect we'd witness a similarly dramatic restructuring of our legal order. So have we? Have we entered a new era of constitutional law? And I think more important than that descriptive question of whether COVID has already changed our legal culture is the prescriptive question. Should it change our legal culture? Should we let it? Do you personally, each of you, do you want COVID to bring about a dramatic restructuring of our constitutional order? And if you don't, what are you going to do about it? Those are the questions I'd like us to think about together today. So we're almost 2 years removed from the start of the coronavirus crisis, and the previously unimaginable government interventions that swept the country in the spring of 2020 have subsided for the most part. I will say that coming from Texas, where my most frequent reminder of COVID is the handful of people who still choose to wear masks in the grocery store, to Chicago, where some of your civil rights depend on your vaccination status, is a little bit of a culture shock. But even though government restrictions are not abating at the same pace everywhere around the country, they do seem to, in general, be on a downward trend. And life in much of America, even if not in Chicago, is pretty much back to the old normal. And as life seems to get back to normal, it's tempting to think that the law will naturally follow suit, and to think that maybe we can just put 2020 in the memory hole and carry on as if nothing changed and everything is back to normal. But lest we forget, there was nothing normal, absolutely nothing normal, about the government ordering American citizens to stay in their houses unless they had an approved reason to leave. There was nothing normal about the indefinite suspension of the right to peaceably assemble. There was nothing normal about the government ordering houses of worship to close their doors. And there was nothing normal about all of this being done, not by the give and take of the legislative process, but by executive branch officials using sweeping unilateral emergency powers. Given everything that's happened in our country over the last 2 years, I think there's never been a more important time, at least in my lifetime, for us as lawyers and judges to do some serious thinking about our commitment to our Constitution. Among the many concerns that have motivated the response to COVID, preservation of constitutional rights has not seemed to be very high on many people's priority lists. As a legal community, and more broadly as a people, we need to confront the wreckage of the last 2 years. We need to reckon with the state of our Constitution, And we need to decide what kind of government we want to pass on to the next generation. I'd like to focus briefly on the question of religious liberty during COVID, because it's one of the starkest examples of previously unimaginable government action that came and went during 2020, but that we shouldn't just pretend didn't happen. The freedom of religion is, of course, one of the bedrocks of our constitutional order. It's the first freedom enshrined in the Bill of Rights. It's the reason that so many of our ancestors immigrated to America, whether it was the Pilgrims 400 years ago or many people from all over the world much more recently. And given the First Amendment and given our nation's history and traditions, many people could never have imagined the forced closure of churches on a mass scale in this country. That's the kind of thing that might happen in Russia or China, but not here. Maybe if there was a really bad contagious disease going around, you might have thought, well, most people would choose to stay home from church. But surely the government in America wouldn't forcibly close houses of worship against their will. But it did. And in terms of the legal rationale for it, a lot of people pointed to the Supreme Court's decision in Jacobson versus Massachusetts from a little over 100 years ago, which upheld compulsory smallpox vaccination. And early on in the pandemic, this was pointed to frequently. And they said, well, essentially Jacobson means that the government can do whatever it thinks is necessary to protect public health in a pandemic. But Jacobson, of course, involved compulsory vaccination. And as controversial a topic as that may be, there's no explicit provision in the text of the Constitution protecting people against compulsory vaccination, at least not yet. So without prejudging the constitutionality of compulsory vaccination, we can all agree that the text of the Constitution doesn't mention vaccines. There's no vaccine clause, but there is a free exercise clause. And there is a right to peaceably assemble, right there in the First Amendment, whether the public health department likes it or not. Reciting the First Amendment might seem like making an obvious point, but it was G.K. Chesterton who said, "Every high civilization decays by forgetting obvious things." My own view, which I've expressed in a case called In re Abbott, is that courts should very strictly scrutinize pandemic measures that interfere with rights afforded by our state and federal constitutions. If that's not the case, if the rule is instead that courts should defer to the scientific opinions of public health authorities when they decide it's not safe for people to gather, to worship, or to protest, or just to be together as families, then it seems to me that we don't actually have those rights to religious liberty or to peaceable assembly. We have only privileges, which we can exercise only when the government thinks it's safe for us to do it. But of course, the whole point of having a right to something is that you get to do it even when the government thinks you shouldn't. I mentioned the Pilgrims just a minute ago, and I'm reading right now an American history book in the evenings to my children. And I've been struck, as I am so often when I think about early American history, by the extreme hardships endured by the early settlers. Disease, starvation, drowning at sea. Time after time, in the story of each new colony that was carved out of the wilderness, we read that the reason they endured these unspeakable hardships was so that they could worship God freely in the New World. Benjamin Franklin famously said, "Those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little safety deserve neither liberty nor safety." Well, the people who settled and founded this country gave up their safety entirely in the relentless pursuit of liberty. The tension between liberty and safety that we've all experienced during COVID is nothing new. It's an intractable question that every generation has to confront. What is new, perhaps, is the overwhelming preference for safety over liberty that so many of our powerful institutions demonstrated during COVID. But the question itself, should our government prioritize our liberty or our safety, is among the oldest political questions around. And I want to stop and focus on that word, political. People often use that word these days, political, as sort of a put down. And I think that's wrong-headed. In truth, politics is what separates us from dictatorship. No public health official, no scientist can dictate to a self-governing people how to strike the right balance between safety and liberty in the face of a contagious disease. We, the people of this country, have the right and the responsibility to answer that question for ourselves. And we do so through politics. Politics shouldn't be a dirty word. It's a wonderful thing. It's a blessing. It's the way that a free people shapes its destiny. It's a precious heritage passed down to us by people who faced hardships we can't even imagine, so that we could govern ourselves through politics, instead of being ruled by unaccountable authorities like kings or experts. What a blessing it is to be able to resolve our disagreements peaceably through politics, rather than to be dictated to by unaccountable government power exercised in the name of science. You hear often people bemoaning how COVID became quickly so political. And I think often they're really complaining about the distasteful personalities involved in our politics, or the rancorous and vindictive way that so much of our political debate is carried on. And I think that that's understandable. But sometimes what people seem to be saying when they bemoan the politics of COVID, and this I think is a dangerous idea, is that our response to COVID shouldn't be political. It should be scientific. They contrast politics and science. They cast politics as low and dirty and inefficient, and science as pure and noble and effective. And they chastise us to follow the science. And there are at least two enormous assumptions, right, in the follow the science mantra. First, of course, is the assumption that government scientists are capable of accurately understanding the disease and coming up with effective means of combating it through government policy. And whether that's a valid assumption is a big question that we'll put to the side, and we'll assume that. Let's assume for now that even if the government could stop COVID or any other disease, if it wanted to, assume that, there's still another assumption that you have to make before you would just agree that government policy should follow the science. You'd have to assume that reduction of the transmission of the disease is the highest and best value to be pursued, and that all government policy should pursue that value at the expense of all other values. You'd have to assume that our government should value our safety far more highly than it values our liberty. But that value judgment is itself political. You've assumed away the biggest, most important question, a question that a free society can only answer by politics. And that question is, how willing are we to give up our ancient liberties for the chance that we might reduce the impact of a respiratory virus or of any other danger that we face? The question is it more important to stay safe or to stay free? There's so much more to this wonderful life than just staying alive. And how do we put a value on all of that? A free people, a sovereign people, would answer this question of competing values for themselves, and then would dictate to their government how it should behave in light of their value judgment. An unfree people, a subject people, must accept the answer dictated to them by those in power and then helplessly endure whatever hardships the government imposes on them. Which of those descriptions, the sovereign people or the subject people, better describes us over the last 2 years? I think it's a mixed result, to be fair. But there are signs of the sovereign people reasserting themselves. In Texas, last fall. In November of 2021, we had an election where we voted for or against constitutional amendments. And the people of Texas decided that they would dictate to their government rather than the other way around. They chose not to leave it up to scientists or judges to decide whether they can worship as they choose the next time that somebody declares a pandemic. They exercised their sovereign right to amend their state constitution, and they added this language: this state or a political subdivision of this state may not enact, adopt, or issue a statute, order, proclamation, decision, or rule that prohibits or limits religious services, including religious services conducted in churches, congregations, and places of worship in this state by a religious organization established to serve the propagation of a sincerely held religious belief. The adoption of this amendment, this direct rejection by the sovereign people of a pandemic measure that they never wanted to see again, I think reflects something very healthy. Whether you agree with it or not, in substance, it reflects that the people are still very much sovereign when they choose to be. So as I close, go back to where we started and ask, are we already in a new normal? The people of Texas have certainly said the answer is no, at least when it comes to government restrictions of religious services. But of course, there are many other ways that the world around us seems to have changed and continues to change over the last few years. And here I'm talking about COVID, sure, but not just about COVID, but also other changes that we see taking place all around us. And we need to ask ourselves, will we accept these things as the new normal? Or will we, as our forefathers did, boldly pursue liberty in the face of danger? That's a question that each of us needs to answer for ourselves. And depending on your answer, there may be a price to pay for standing against the tide, for speaking what you believe to be true. Some of you may already have experienced some of that price. I want to assure you that at 41 years old, I have no regret about any of the times that I have stuck my neck out and stood for the truth as I saw it. My only regrets are the times that I had the chance to take that risk, but I chose the safety of silence instead. You all are a group of brilliant young people with limitless possibilities in front of you. You're here at this university because you are the kind of people who have the raw materials that it takes to not just be the sort of person who floats through life seeking money and pleasure, but the person who helps to shape the destiny of your country. That's why you're here. I want to share with you a quote from Abigail Schreier, who was a classmate of mine at Yale Law School. We were in the class of 2005 together. She gave a speech to students at Princeton recently, which you can find online. I encourage you to listen to it. She said this: "You who are studying at one of the greatest academic institutions in the country, only to be told that after graduation, you must think as we tell you and recite from this script. Why were you born? What's the point of being alive? Computers are vastly better at number crunching. They'll soon be better at all kinds of more complex tasks. What they cannot do is stand on principle. What the computer cannot know is the glorious exertion of the human will when it refuses to truckle in the face of lies and instead publicly speaks the truth." I encourage you, as I said, to go listen to the rest of Abigail Schreier's speech online. It's well worth your time. There's a different kind of wilderness out there today. It's a wilderness of lies. And it can be just as unforgiving in its own way as the physical wilderness the early settlers encountered. In the face of that danger, will you seek the safety of silence? Or will you confront the wilderness with the light of truth? Will you accommodate yourself to the new normal? Will your lips repeat things that your heart knows to be false? Lies about what is good and true and beautiful in this world. Lies about the history of this extraordinary country of ours. Lies about our human nature. Things the world wants you to say, but that your conscience tells you are lies. Will you say these things? And again, the old conflict between liberty and safety shows itself. Because there is great safety in accommodating yourself to fashionable opinion. Folks like the people who wrote that McKinsey paper that I started with, they want to hear you say certain things that are very easy to say. You may make more money that way. You may be held in higher esteem by the people whose opinions seem to matter most in our society. You may avoid the risks of social conflict and even ostracism that come from standing for the truth in a wilderness of lies. But at what cost? What kind of a life is that? A life spent suppressing the divine spark that lights the fire of truth within you. No. No. We, all of us, you and me, we are the inheritors of a priceless tradition of liberty and limited self-government, which has been passed down to us by people who faced dangers beyond our wildest dreams, so that we could live today in this beautiful land of abundance and freedom. As with every generation, it's our responsibility, each of us, to do what needs to be done now, whatever the cost to ourselves, to ensure that our children and our children's children will enjoy the same blessings that we enjoy. So what will we do to make sure that happens? What will you do, each of you? Whatever it is for you, whether it's writing, speaking, getting involved in politics, working in government, maybe just raising a family, or being a good friend. Let us speak the truth. Let us do it boldly. Let us be worthy of the generations that came before us. And let us, with God's help, pass the test that our founding fathers laid down for us in the Constitution. Let us secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. Thank you.
We have time for a short Q&A.
Yeah.
And just feel free to raise your hand, and we'll call on you and ask questions. Ed?
Justice, excuse me, Justice Blacklock, one of the things that you mentioned, you mentioned that you were reading a book about the early settlers and how they gave up safety for liberty, right? Being able to worship the way that they wanted. I wonder whether kids today in school are being taught early American history. I know a couple years ago the big thing was the 1619 project in school curriculums. So I would just like to get your thoughts on civic education and whether you're optimistic about it or pessimistic about it in kind of the way that it's heading in the United States.
Well, the question is about civic education, and it's essential to the propagation of freedom, no question about that. And the reason that people fight over it, and that our politics is engaged right now in a discussion about how it should be taught in schools, is because everybody on both sides recognizes how important it is, what we're teaching our children about their country and their history and their role in society. All sides seem to agree about that. And then the question is, what should we teach them? For me as a parent, I feel an obligation that I didn't know I would feel, but particularly as my children get older and grow to the age where they can understand a lot more about what's happening in the world, I feel an obligation to make sure that make sure myself, in the time that I spend with them, that they are educated in the history and traditions of this country. And that's something that as parents, most of you are probably not quite to that stage of your life yet, but you may be before too long. Don't leave it to the school. Take the burden upon yourself to raise your children the way you think they should be raised.
Carl?
Justice Blacklock, thank you so much for being here, and thank you for standing for truth and for liberty. I gotta say, it's refreshing coming from a state like Illinois, where we don't have men like you on the front lines and in leadership positions. I'm wondering, at the beginning of the pandemic, in March 2020, when we suspended the Bill of Rights, it was supposed to be 15 days to slow the spread, and it became 2 years to flatten the country. How do we prevent that from happening again, where we can say, oh, there's an emergency, and so we're just going to suspend the Constitution, and these rights mean nothing? And you spoke a little bit about what the people of Texas have done to their Constitution. How do we put in place safeguards to make sure that this never again happens?
Well, I think we talked about it in the speech, right? It's politics. I mean, we need to reckon with what happened, look back on what happened, and as a people, decide how we would want this to go if it happened again. And it's the people's obligation to put in place the safeguards and protections, or lack thereof, that they want to see the next time this happens. But as I said, I think it's irrespective of what the answers are, the process of looking back on what happened over the last couple of years and thinking, as a free people, how would we want this to go if it happened again? Those are questions that everybody needs to be asking themselves these days.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming, Justice Blacklock. I was wondering, I really liked your image of the wilderness of lies, so I was wondering if you had an example of what you think the most pernicious lie is today for society.
I'll leave that to you to think through that. I think that, as I said, there's a divine spark of truth that lives inside of us, and each of you needs to use your conscience and your intuition to sort through what's the truth and what's a lie, and try to live your life by the truth.
Yeah.
I think I have two comments. One is that it is likely major oversimplification of the early history to say that the Pilgrim religious liberty. If you had been in England in the middle of the 17th century, the threat to safety was severe. And it was that threat that led to the political philosophy which influenced the founders. And that philosophy makes preservation of public safety central to the role of the state. The second comment is, maybe a question, do you think there are any circumstances under which a threat to safety suffices to justify the government in suspending liberty? So let's just take a limited case. There's an active shooter inside a religious facility. Can the government close the doors? Can the police enter, disrupt the services? So where are you going to draw the line? And if
Well,
the
I
line
take it
is
you think the
on
answer is
call,
yes.
well, I take it that there must be some situations that the threat to safety is so great that the state can substitute its judgment for that of each individual person in order to protect those people's lives. And so I think the question
Sure.
is,
Well,
do you agree- do you
okay, let me just
disagree with
answer
that
it this way. I'll answer it this way. As we talked about, the trade-off between safety and liberty is often a political trade-off. There's give and take. There's a lot of room between those two poles that is available to us to work with through the mechanism of politics. And the question is, when you get too far in the direction, one direction or the other, but the direction of safety is more likely to interfere with constitutional rights. When you go too far in that direction, you butt up against things the Constitution says the government's not supposed to do. And all of us as lawyers and judges, but particularly us as judges, need to confront those questions and need to think about where that line is. And it's not, I'm not going to say it's an easy line to draw.
Just one more comment. I think your analysis has assumed that there's almost zero provision for safety in the Constitution, which seems to be an extremely distorted reading of the document. And then second, the discussion, I mean, there may be a trade-off. There may be points where the trade-off is been miscalculated. But what I'm missing so far from the libertarian perspective you've been offering is, why has the pandemic that we've experienced not risen to the level that the public health measures that have been taken were justified? I mean, practically every state, every government around the world has taken parallel measures. 900,000 people in the United States have died. That's not normal. You know, what would it take? If 50 million had died, would that have justified? So, like, just where in your analysis does the safety factor enter, or is it just, it doesn't matter? There's never a threat to safety that suffices to justify any abridgment of liberty. Is that your position?
Well, let me answer you this way. We, as a people, need to look back on what's happened over the last 2 years and decide whether we liked it, whether we agree with it. It sounds like you do, and that's fine. That view is as valid as any other, but those who don't share that view should feel free to speak up and to make their voices heard and to try through politics to affect the way that this sort of thing happens in the future.
Jim.
Oh yeah, thank you very much, Justice Blacklock. Your speech made me miss Texas greatly. One question I have is, you know, prior to the pandemic, the concerns about individual liberty that people had now are still very much present. You know, and a lot of people thought that they were eroding before the pandemic. Do you feel that the COVID pandemic represented a fundamental shift in that individual liberty, or more of an acceleration?
I don't. The difference between a fundamental shift and acceleration is not entirely clear to me. It's a big event in human history, in legal history, in constitutional history. I think it has the potential, if we let it, to become something that Bruce Ackerman would call a constitutional moment, where the meaning of the Constitution, functionally speaking, in terms of the way that government operates, changes, even though the text of the Constitution doesn't. So Professor Ackerman had this theory that our Constitution evolves not so much by textual amendment, but by historical moment. And you can look back in our history, the Civil War, the New Deal, the Civil Rights Movement. These are times where you might say, well, there was a moment where the way we looked at our Constitution changed, irrespective of the words in the document. And that's a theory that's been debated a lot, and may have some valid points to make or may not. But a good way to think about this is, do we want COVID to be a constitutional moment that leads us into a new era? What would that new era look like? Do we want to go there? And if we don't, what are we going to do to stop it from happening?
I think you have time for about 2 more questions. It's your time.
We've seen a lot of debates recently in this country about what powers the government has to restrict what teachers teach in K-12 education or what professors teach in college education. I'm curious what leeway you think the First Amendment allows elected officials to restrict or to otherwise direct what professors teach at state universities.
That's an interesting question. I thought you were going to ask about public schools, K through 12 public schools, and
I feel like the state university question is more difficult.
It is more difficult because the notion that the people who elect school boards and pay the taxes wouldn't have a say in what goes on at the school is just sort of a bizarre notion. Universities, I suppose, are a little bit of a tougher case, but I don't know. I mean, they're publicly funded, people are paying the taxes, the government is in charge of the school, and I don't know what formal mechanism would exist in the law or elsewhere to prohibit the government from having a say in what goes on at public universities. Now, if cases like that came to the court, we'd have to take a look at what the arguments were, but nothing comes to my mind that would prohibit the government from having a say in what happens at its universities.
Yeah.
Thank you, Justice Blacklock. I was curious, you mentioned how Texas took this more substantive change to reassert protection of religious liberty. I'm curious if you think structural change also might be an appropriate solution, maybe trying to rethink the relationship between branches, reducing the executive's role in favor of the legislature, or do you think just handing off to the legislature isn't necessarily going to solve some of these issues either?
Well, that leads to, I think, an important point, which is one of the ways that our government looked so different over the last 2 years than we were used to it looking, was that so many of the rules that were telling us how to live our lives day to day came from governors or mayors or executive branch officials who were issuing unilateral decrees, which is not the way we're used to being governed, right? And so what's happened in a lot of states, including in Texas, is a pretty robust debate about the emergency statutes that gave the executive branch those powers. We actually, at the last legislative session in Texas, our House passed one bill that would have restricted executive power in an emergency. Our Senate passed another bill that also would have restricted it, but they didn't get together and agree on a bill. And so even though both chambers wanted to pull back a little bit on executive power for the next time around, it didn't happen. So I imagine they'll take it up again in the next legislative session. But that debate is happening all over the country in different places, and that, I think, is perhaps one of the most important questions that we need to ask ourselves about how this should go next time, is that procedurally, where should these rules be coming from?
Well, please, everyone, join me in thanking Justice Blacklock for taking lunch is provided outside.